So the final component that we're going to measure for our overall macroeconomic picture is unemployment. And the reason is that particularly we are interested not just in production, but we're also interested in whether we're managing to employ the people in our economy in the process of production. So this means that unemployment turns out to be one of the biggest areas of macroeconomics, and so we're going to do some work on that. These measures definitely don't exhaust everything, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this video, but this particular measure is going to conclude at least our current focus on measures and how we measure. So in order to think of unemployment, what you have to remember is that we have to spend some time thinking about what it means to be unemployed. I can't just say, oh, somebody doesn't have a job, they're unemployed. You might say that colloquially, but you know, if I got a trust fund and I don't have a job and I'm sitting at home very happily, it's not a problem. It's not anybody's concern. Government doesn't have to do anything. Economists don't have to be worried. I'm not going to call that unemployed. So I am going to particularly focus on defining unemployment in a way that actually pays attention to the particular issues we're trying to pick up on, which is people trying to find work and not being able to get it. So here are some things that we're going to look at. The Bureau of Labor Statistics actually collects this data. It does surveys, it tracks this, and it's very specific definitions that we use in the United States to measure unemployment. First thing, let's just start by thinking about a population. Our overall population includes people who are in the labor force plus people who are not in the labor force. And I'm going to have to define these two things quite carefully. So for example, someone who is retired is not in the labor force. We often look at people who are stay-at-home mothers, for example, and think they're not in the labor force, right? Children not in the labor force, right? So we know that there are people who are not in the labor force, and then we know that there are people in the labor force. So I'm going to have to think of what is in these categories in order to measure them correctly. And so here is the way in which we measure them. The first is, I'm going to say that you could have a job if you're employed. But here's the thing you want to understand. I'm not asking you, do you like your job? Is it a part-time job? Is it a crap job? I'm not interested in any of that. I'm not going to ask you, are you looking for some other job? Are you looking to leave? None of that. What I'm going to ask you is, A, are you eligible to work? So any person 16 years of age or older, working full-time or part-time, even for a few hours. Right? If you work a few hours, I'm going to count you. Right? I think the technical thing is that you want to be working for pay, right? And then you can work in your family business without pay. I'll still count you as employed. Right? So if you work for your family business, I'm going to count it as you're employed because you're working at least a certain number of hours. In your family business, it's part of the way you're doing things, all right? So if you work full-time or part-time for pay, you work without pay in a family business, or for example, you don't have pay right now, but you're just on leave. You're on medical leave, right? You've got a temporary absence, so you're not earning something right now, but still you've got a job you're going to go back to, right? I'm going to count you as employed. Any of those things, full-time, part-time work, working without pay for your family business, on leave, but you're going to return to your job, you're considered employed. Then you have to be similarly ready, willing, and able to work, eligible to work, 16 years of age or older, and you have to demonstrate to me that you want work by actively seeking work in the past 4 weeks. Then I will count you as unemployed, not otherwise. So, people often say, oh, they're unemployed, they're not doing anything, they could just look for a job. Actually, we don't count people who are not looking for a job under the unemployed. You have to show, and when you look at the surveys that the BLS uses, you will find that they ask things like, did you send out resumes? Did you go to interviews? Did you apply for job, right? So you have to actively seek work. So the unemployed are people who have actively have not managed to be employed at all and have shown that they're actively seeking work. That is the unemployed. And then if you're not employed and you're not unemployed, then you are not in the labor force. And so the population is the total labor force and not in the labor force. The labor force consists of these two groups, the employed and the unemployed, because these are the two groups who are either working or they have shown actively by their efforts to hunt for work that they want to be in the labor force. Right? The unemployment rate is the percentage of the unemployed to the labor force. The labor force participation rate is how many people in my economy are in the labor force, right? All of these give us a different picture of different things going on. So let me go through them kind of briefly so you understand what's going on. The one that lots of people focus on, of course, is the unemployment rate. And that is because if there are a lot of people looking for work but not able to find it, then that is an indication that there is a problem in this economy that needs to be fixed, right? So that's one thing. And then we have to think about why it's going on. I'll come to in a minute. Second, there are all kinds of reasons people are not in the labor force. It's not automatically a bad thing. Nobody wants someone to be working until they're 80 years old, 90 years old. You want people to be able to have retirement. We want children who are not in the labor force to be supported by people who are in the labor force, right? So not in the labor force, not in itself a bad thing, but the overall labor force participation rate to population gives you a sense of what percentage of your population is actually able to participate in economic activity. And that's important, for example, if you have an aging population. If you've got an aging population, you've got a lot of people who are not in the labor force, and then you're going to have to worry about how do we take care of this, because it's the people who are going to be in the labor force who have to figure out doing the production that takes care of those not in the labor force, right? Whereas in some countries you have a very young population, and so then you've got a different kind of problem, which is not that people are not in the labor force, but you might have very high levels of youth unemployment, right? So these are the kinds of questions that this allows you to look at. Not in the labor force, unemployment rate, and things like that. In addition to that, once I have a sense or a big picture of what the overall unemployment issues are, I then also want to spend some time thinking through what's the causes for why people may be unemployed. Now, it could be that people are unemployed because there is recessions, and we'll come to that, and that's one kind of problem. We call that cyclical unemployment. But it could also be that people are unemployed because there's been a massive technological reorganization of work, and you have to retrain your labor force. They just can't get jobs under the new tech, for example. So if there is huge structural issues that you have to reorganize, then that's called structural unemployment. And that's got a different kind of way to solve it than cyclical unemployment. Right? Now, you might also have to worry, as I said, about ways in which your unemployment rate tracks the actual issue. So just as the measurement issues were a problem in CPI, it can overestimate, underestimate, or GDP, is it really measuring well-being or not? With unemployment rate, we need to have some cautions. Some of the ways in which the unemployment rate turns out to be a problem is that for a long time we had to actually really rethink how, for example, the data used to treat women. It used to be assumed, for example, that when they asked a woman, they would say, "Oh, are you working?" She'd say no, and they'd be like, "Oh, she doesn't want to work." Now, as it turned out, once you drill down over time, we realized the women wanted to work, but the jobs were not there, right? And so that's one thing. So we've had to do a whole bunch of work very successfully in the field of feminist economics to reorganize and rethink how we address gender dynamics in unemployment. And thankfully that work has done very well. And so we do have data which we can look at and so on. The second thing is that the way we define employment may not actually be a very useful way if part of my concern is structural unemployment or jobs. So for example, if I've got a ton of people weren't able to get jobs, you trained as an engineer, and finally you become a grocery bagger because, you got to pay bills. Suddenly you're going to show up as employed. And people have no problem. You got a job. You got a part-time job bagging groceries, right? So you want to start drilling down to the types of occupations people have, right? You also want to start thinking about what is called the discouraged worker effect. It turns out that when you are in periods of really deep recessions, or as we had in 2008 on sort of these really long sort of recession as we had, the impact of that on the psychology of people actually affects the unemployment rate. So think about this. You're graduating, you graduated, there's no jobs. You sent out your resume. You sent out your resume. You sent out your resume. You want a job, but after you don't get interviews 50 times, you might feel like, I don't want to send out another resume, right? The moment you do that, you've suddenly stopped being unemployed and you've become not in the labor force. Because remember, to be unemployed, you have to show you were actively seeking work, right? And so what happens is sometimes people drop out of the labor force because they get discouraged. That's the discouraged worker effect. And what the problem is that then we underestimate how much support or how much intervention we need to do in order to address the issue. So once the job starts, suddenly a lot of these people who were not in the labor force, they rejoin the labor force. And you might not have realized you had that level of unemployment because they had just become discouraged. And so we need to do a lot more work when we interpret the data to just think carefully about, is it cyclical or structural unemployment? How are we thinking about different categories of workers? What do we think about part-time work or the types of jobs people are getting? And how are we handling discouraged worker effects and things like that? And those are sort of not something you have to worry about all the time, but those are salient every so often when you hit sort of major hiccups, and then people's sort of behavior starts to shift as a result of that. But overall, unemployment, the way we measure it, we take a lot of care to collect this data so that we have a really good image and a good picture of what the issues are that are faced in our economy, so that we can come up with policies that are targeted at the problem. So now we've got an overall picture of our economy in terms of what are we producing. We've got an idea of whether this production is taking place in terms of different sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, services. We have some sense of what proportion of this is wages, rent, interest, profit. That gives us some sense of wage distribution. We also have a good sense of where the stuff's going. Is it a lot of it is ending up with the government? We've got huge spending by the government. Are we exporting a lot? What are we doing? All right. And then finally, we do have a good sense of inflation, what's happening to inflation, and we've got a good sense of unemployment. Where is our population? Where are they working? What are they doing? What we still don't have, and what we need to remember, is that this gives us a good picture, but not a sufficient picture. So for example, we may want to supplement this data when we're doing country studies with issues such as what is the natural resource base of this country? We might want to think a little bit about landmass, arable land. We might want to think about what some of the resource bases are. We might want to think about the educational level of the workforce, right? We might also want to think about income distribution. Are there a teeny number of rich people and lots of poor people? Is it a more or less egalitarian society? So we would want measures such as, these are called sometimes Gini coefficients. There are various ways to measure income distribution that we use. So there's a lot more data and information that we might start adding as we want to get a clearer and clearer picture of what's happening in an economy. But as a way to start in an intro class and just to get an initial handle on macroeconomy, this level of information will be our starting point. Thank you.